Also in this room on climate change with Dr. Amrit Gunasekara from California Department of Food and Agriculture. So hopefully you'll be able to join us on that date. We do have an email list going around if you want to sign up for future emails for future events. And then if you just want to like us on Facebook, Modesto Area Partners in Science, we might show up in your news feed. And the one last thing I wanted to mention, we also have a partner series, which is Science Colloquium on Wednesdays. And that's next door in,
Science Community Center.
yeah, it's the Science Community Center, 127? I have no idea where it is. Yeah, in room 115, downstairs in the Science Community Center at 3:15. Next week, Dr. Richard Anderson, he's a professor emeritus from MJC, will be speaking on the 6th extinction, but he's actually arguing that it's the 7th big extinction on our planet of flora and fauna. So if you'd like to join us for that. And tonight we have Dr. John Hafernik, professor of biology at San Francisco State University and past president of the California Academy of Sciences. He is also the former president of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, Pacific Division, and of the Pacific Coast Entomological Society. He served as chair of the SF State Biology Department from 1992 to 2005, and as interim director of the San Francisco State Romberg Tiburon Center for Environmental Studies from 2013 to 2014. He became fascinated with insects and the natural world as a young boy growing up in Texas, and he moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in 1970 to pursue a doctorate in entomology at UC Berkeley. He then joined the faculty at SF State in 1977. His research focuses on the evolutionary and ecological processes at the population or species level and conservation biology of insects. Currently, he is investigating the impact of a new parasite of honeybees, which he discovered on the San Francisco State campus. And if you ever visit that campus, they have a hive on campus. Two San Francisco State alums over here that pointed out to me once. It's kind of exciting that they had a hive right there. And they discovered this parasite there. He's the co-founder of Zombie Watch, a citizen science project that has been featured on Scientific American, Science Friday, and the Discovery Channel, KQED, and the New York Times, and a lot of other media outlets. Zombie Watch is one of the top 10 citizen science projects of 2015 by Science Starter and Discover magazine. So if you will join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here in Modesto and to see such a good crowd of people interested in science. It's great to see. I'm going to start out tonight by asking you a simple question. All I'm going to ask you to do is to tell me what comes to your mind. What do you see when you I can get this to work? Here we go. When you hear the word bee, what do you think of? What pops into your mind? Honeybees? Pollinators? Ouch. Yeah, all of these are good ideas. Most of the time when I ask people, and I give talks from everywhere from kindergarten to 85-year-old people. Last night I talked to the Sierra Club, and I felt young again for that dinner. They're mostly people much older than me. And people mostly have the same response. That is, when they think about bees, they tend to think about one species of bee, this one, Apis mellifera, which is the honeybee. And honeybees are really important in this part of the world, especially this time of the year when the almonds are blooming and need pollination. But some things to know about the honeybee. It's not native to California. It's not native to North America. It was brought in by the European colonists. And also, it's only one of many different kinds of bees that you might find around in the Modesto area and beyond. Actually, there are over 20,000 different species of bees worldwide, and only one of those is the honeybee. Turns out that there are 4,000 species of bees in North America, in the US, and at least 1,600 in California. So we've got a rich fauna of bees, and many of them are different than the honeybee in the ways that they live. Only about 10% of them are social and live together in a hive-like setting. Most of them are solitary. They're living in the ground in holes or in twigs or places like that. But for the most part, they, like the honeybee, are really critical to pollination. They're visiting flowers, both agricultural plants and native plants, and are responsible for pollination. But 15% of these bees are actually cuckoo parasites. What do cuckoos do? Any ornithologists in the audience? Yeah, they figured out a better way to rear their young. They find somebody else to do it. And it's not just grandparents. They'll lay their egg in another bird's nest, fly away, and when the egg hatches, the other species of bird will take care of those young hatchlings and feed them and take care of them. And these bees do much the same thing. They will come in, lay their egg in a solitary bee's nest where it's been provisioned, and then take it over and feed on that provision. So a lot of variety in the natural world. And one of the things I hope that you'll take away from this talk is that there are many different kinds of bees in California and beyond. In San Francisco, we probably have 100 species of bees, probably more than that in the Modesto area. You wouldn't have to go very far to find that. Here's some examples of some of our native bees. Some of them really gorgeous, like this green sweat bee, the upper left-hand area. It's a ground nesting bee that kind of nests together in groups. This digger bee is about the size of a bumblebee in like sandy areas. Some of them are really quite small. That's a bee in a California poppy flower for scale. It's the sort of thing you might walk by and never even notice because it's so small, but still really important and critical to pollination of a number of species, especially our native plant species. Okay. I seem to have lost this device, so I'm going to walk over here and do it from here. One of the things that we know about our native bees is that, like honeybees, they are also being threatened by a variety of different things. This is a study that was done about a year ago, at least it was published about a year ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the major scientific journals in North America. And it shows areas where native bees are at most risk. So the red areas especially are areas in the country where we see especially strong threats to this diversity of native bees that are important in pollination and in the ecological fabric of these areas. You might notice where one of those areas is. Yeah, we're in the middle of it right here in the Great Central Valley of California. And the other areas you see up in the Dakotas are areas where we're doing a lot of growth of corn now. Corn for ethanol production primarily rather than for cattle feed or for human feeding. And a lot of this threat comes from the way in which these crops are produced, taking habitat out from these native pollinators that actually, if they were allowed to live near some of the crops, would actually be able to pollinate them and help out. Now, corn is wind pollinated, so it doesn't rely on bees, but many of our other crops, of course, do. There are a number of native species of bees now that we recognize as being threatened. And in this last year, we had the first native bees listed as endangered species. Now, these are Hawaiian yellow-faced bees. So you're not going to find them flying around the Central Valley. You have to do one of those hardship trips, fly to Hawaii, any of the islands, and look for some of these little bees that are flying around. They're native to Hawaii. And one of the things about Hawaii is that it's probably the one place in the world that's been invaded the most by a variety of different plants and animals that have been brought there, both on purpose and accidentally. So when you get out of a plane on the Big Island or someplace like that and look around, virtually everything that you see around you is not native to the islands of Hawaii, but it's been brought there. You have to actually go up on the volcanoes or to some of the areas to find remnant populations of these really wonderful native plants and animals that were there. These bees were part of that system, and they're really critical as pollinators of those native plants. So if we lose the bees, we potentially lose the plants. And in fact, there are some plants in Hawaii now that were typically bird pollinated by native Hawaiian birds that have now gone extinct that have to be hand pollinated in order to maintain them in the ecological system there. So these are really important creatures in the ecological context. Just a few weeks ago, this species was listed, almost listed, as an endangered species in the eastern United States. It's the rusty-patched bumblebee. This is a bee that used to be widely distributed across the eastern part of North America and now is only found in a few places in Illinois and those areas. And it was listed as an endangered species, but the rules are that you put out the listing and then it takes a month for that to actually go into effect. And so this bee has now been caught in sort of the political no man's land that's Washington, D.C. this moment. When all the regulations were frozen, the listing of this bee was frozen as well. And so we'll have to see what happens in another month or so if the decision is to go forward with it or if it will remain threatened and endangered but not officially listed as endangered. But you don't have to go to the eastern U.S. to find creatures like that as well. Here in the western U.S., we have a couple of species of bumblebees that are equally threatened but haven't been listed yet. One is Franklin's bumblebee that's found up the Pacific coast and may well be extinct. It hasn't been seen in several years now. And the other is the western bumblebee, which used to be widely distributed across western North America, and a few years ago started suddenly declining precipitously across its range in wildlands and in urban areas. So it's sort of a puzzle as to what's going on with this species. We think it's probably introduced diseases that are brought in, fungal diseases that were brought in with bumblebees that were brought in for pollinating within greenhouses, because bumblebees do a good job of pollinating in greenhouses. Honeybees don't do so well. They fly against the wall, but bumblebees figure out how to find tomatoes and things like that. So we equally have threatened native bees here, but you're probably aware that the honeybee has also had a number of threats against it in recent times. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it just to give you some background. So I mentioned it's not native to North America. It's native to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was brought in by the early colonists back in the 1600s. They brought them in on ships. That's because even then people had a sweet tooth and they loved honey. So they brought their bees with them. But honeybee culture goes way back before that. There are even examples of it on cave paintings in places like that in Europe, showing early humans having domesticated honeybees for their production of honey. And if you go back into the ancient Egyptian pyramids, you'll find glyphs and paintings that illustrate the love of the Egyptians for honey as well. The coat of arms on the lower left there is Napoleon's coat of arms. It has honeybees mixed in it. Napoleon was a big fan of honeybees as well. But these were brought to us. They got loose in the eastern U.S., as honeybees will do. They started forming their own colonies outside of the managed hives, but they got stopped by the Rocky Mountains. And it wasn't until 1850 that honeybees made it to California. How'd they get here? By boat, around the tip of South America and up to San Francisco, back in the gold rush days when people were craving sweets as well. Now, honeybees are among the very highly social bees. These are bees that live together in hives, and they have a single reproductive in that hive, the queen bee, which you've probably all heard about. The workers themselves are also female, but they're sterile. They're incapable of producing young for the most part. Now, I should tell you an Aristotle story. Everyone recall Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher. I'm sure you may have all heard about him at one time or another. He was one of the first biologists, actually, among other things. And he had a way of understanding the world. You know, he would have a very logical way of understanding the world. One of the things he knew from his observation was that only men carried weapons. All right, so you could deduce from that that any organism that was carrying a weapon must be male, right? Perfect logic. So he thought all honeybee workers were males because they had weapons. They had stingers. And they could sting you and protect the hive. But he was wrong, because those stingers are actually a modified bee's ovipositor. The ovipositor is the egg-laying device of a female. So not only was he wrong, he was really wrong in this case. He thought there was a king bee, but there's a queen bee, and occasionally the queen will produce males, which we call drones, these creatures with the big eyes and big muscles, and they then will fly out, and if they're lucky, they'll find a virgin queen bee and mate with her. But that doesn't happen very often, and only a small percentage of the bees in the hive at any one time are males. Anyone know how you produce a male honeybee? It's different than you produce a male human. You know, I have an X and a Y chromosome, so I'm male. Some of you have XX. There may be some other combinations in here as well. But it's done differently in honeybees. Honeybees, males have no fathers. They're produced from an unfertilized egg. So all the queen bee has to do is to not fertilize an egg, and she can produce a male. She can produce a male anytime she needs one. That means males are also expendable. So at times when there's not enough food around, etc., get the guys out of there. You can produce them later when you need their ability to maybe mate with a new queen bee. So worker honeybees have an interesting life. They go through a series of jobs, kind of just like humans do now. Now, I've had the same job since 1977. That's not going to happen to many people in today's society. All the younger people here will probably change jobs a number of times during your lifetime. You'll be like a honeybee worker. They start out as house bees. House bees take care of the hive, they clean it out, they feed the young larvae pollen and nectar that they need, or the stored honey preserves. They build the wax combs at the honeycombs. And if it gets too hot in there, they'll air condition the hive by bringing in water and fanning their wings over it, have evaporative cooling to cool it down. They also will defend a hive if necessary. And if you go up and shake a hive, you can observe this happening. I don't recommend that to you. You do that, and the guard bees at the entrance to the hive will raise their abdomens. They'll expose a gland on the tip of their abdomen. They'll waft their wings to waft the pheromone coming off of that gland into the interior of the hive, and that's like a bugle call. Calls all the bees out to protect the hive and come after you if you're the one that's trying to be the honey thief to take the hives out. It's kind of an adaptation for the kind of honey thieves that they probably dealt with in nature, bears and other kinds of animals. But now humans often are doing that. And of course they have the barbed stingers that will make life nasty for you if they actually sting you. Although when they sting you, the workers actually commit suicide because that barbed stinger will pull their stinger out as they try and get away. The ultimate protection. And then the last thing they do is to go out and collect pollen and nectar. So the bees that you see around your backyards and places like that are the older bees. That's the last thing they do in their lives. And they'll do that for a week, for a month or maybe 6 weeks of their lives. Produce new honeybee hives, they swarm. This is my neighbor's house. These are honeybees. Yeah, she was lucky enough to have a feral swarm of honeybees decide that the wonderful place to live was in between the walls of her house. So they set up a hive in between the void there, and I thought it was great. I could see it from my backyard. She kept asking me, she actually rented, and she was talking to her landlord about trying to get them out, but it was hard to get them out of there. So they persisted for a number of years, and periodically they would split and form a new colony. They'd swarm. So this is half of that colony flying out, and somewhere in there is the queen bee along with them. They'll fly away and then form sort of a temporary aggregation while the workers look for a new place to live. This is now in my backyard. And you can see this mass of honeybees that's formed on a pine tree in my backyard. And these worker bees that are flying in and out, they've been checking out holes in trees and other places. And they come in and they do dances on the mass of bees. And eventually they convince the whole mass of bees to follow them. One of the successful workers, follow them back to a hole someplace and take up residence in that new site, in a tree or the walls of a house. I actually did find my house once as well, so I had them in the walls of my house for a while. Back in the hive itself, the workers have selected a few cells to feed royal jelly, along with the honey and nectar that they feed larvae, and that causes these developing larvae to become sexually mature and develop into queen bees. And this sort of peanut-shaped shell is a queen cell, where a queen bee will emerge. She'll come out, and then this will be a new virgin queen. In order to be able to produce more female workers, she needs to mate, find a male, and have sperm that she can use to produce females. So she'll fly out on a nuptial flight, and wouldn't you know it, the males are out there waiting for her. This is their one chance in life to perhaps do something. And they're anxious. There may be males that have come from different colonies as well flying around there. She'll fly up high in the air. The drones follow her, and the lucky ones that capture her, catch up with her in flight, will mate with her. She'll mate several times during that nuptial flight probably, then fly back, and that's the only day in her life that she'll mate. No hanky-panky in the hives. Nothing. Nothing. She'll store that sperm, though, and she'll have literally the ability to fertilize hundreds and hundreds of thousands of eggs during her lifetime. And that will be her business for the rest of her life. But of course, honeybees themselves are big business. Many of you in this part of the world know that. There are more than 2 million honeybee colonies that are rented each year by farmers and agricultural concerns. About this time of the year, the majority of commercial honeybee colonies in North America end up in the Central Valley of California. So I'm talking of over 1 million hives, not 1 million bees. Each hive will have 50 to 80,000 bees in it. So we're talking billions, hundreds of billions of bees that are put on the backs of trucks, trucked into California, set up in the almond orchards for almond pollination at this time of year. It's an amazing feat that this now happens. And those almond farmers, I'm told, now pay about $200 a hive for the privilege of using the pollination services provided by these bees. Overall, it provides perhaps $20 billion or more in annual value to farmers in the United States, and even more if you consider backyard crops and things of that sort, where these bees are important as well. So they're really critical to our diet. If you don't really like to just eat corn and wheat, which are wind pollinated, then you better thank a honeybee, because they've been really an important part of that, as have some of our native bees as well, and a few other species of creatures that help in pollination. But one of the concerns we've had recently is this phenomenon that's been called colony collapse disorder. This is something that was discovered by a beekeeper in Pennsylvania back in 2006. And he would visit his bee colonies about every month to make sure they were doing all right in the various places he had them. And he started noticing that when he visited them, some of the colonies were just vacant. There's nobody home. There were dead bodies. There might still be some larvae, some brood inside there, but the bees had basically abandoned the hive, and the hive collapsed. Basically, it had failed without any particular evidence of what the culprit for that might be, the cause. And this became a great mystery, and it still remains pretty much of a mystery to this day. Now, honeybees are facing all kinds of challenges right now from a number of things that mostly have been brought in from other parts of the world. Introduced diseases of various sorts, fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, viral diseases, introduced mites that in some cases can transmit those diseases back and forth as well. So all of us that work on honeybee problems are sworn to tell you that it's probably caused by multiple agents operating together, maybe in different ways, in different places, and it's complicated. And that means that we don't really understand what's going on yet, right? But we do understand that honeybees are dying, their colonies are failing at an alarming rate. In the last year, about 40% of colonies failed over the course of the year. Most of those in the fall and winter, when times are tough and hives are most stressed, but alarmingly now an increasing number in the summer as well. from, again, a variety of these causes, primarily parasites and pathogens of various sorts, but perhaps pesticides as well. So there are many causes. I've mentioned that some of them already: viral diseases, fungal diseases, parasites like these varroa mites, these little scab-like things on this bee pupa. And there's also been concern about a relatively new class of insecticides called the neonicotinoids. Why do you think they're called neonicotinoids? Nicotine, right. These are synthetic nicotines, basically, that are used as an insecticide. And I used to tell my students that the best thing you can do with a cigarette is to ground it up, make a pulsion of water with it, and use it as an insecticide to kill aphids with it. Don't smoke it, because it's a really potent insecticide. It's a nerve poison that affects and kills insects at a pretty high level. So these are insecticides that actually have a low toxicity to humans if you ingest them, but a very high toxicity to insects, even at low concentrations. So they seem like the perfect pesticides, except that when they're widely distributed, they have the potential at low concentrations to affect the behavior of things like bees, because they're nerve poisons, they're brain poisons, and they can potentially affect the ability of bees to find their way back to their hives, be confused, and so on, even if they're not killed. But I want to talk to you about a more recently discovered threat, the fact that indeed zombies are real. This is my Halloween costume. That's an alternative fact. That's not actually me. I'm smarter than that. But this is a beekeeper who has basically produced a bee helmet, I suppose you'd have to call it. What he did was he put a queen bee right about here in his nose, and all the bees clustered around her. Sometimes beekeepers will make bee beards. Put it here, you get a nice beard of bees. I haven't ever tried that. But the bees are pretty docile in this case. You need to know your bees, though, before you try this at home, right? But really, I'm not really so concerned about this kind of strange guy here who's acting like a zombie, but more about perhaps some of these individual bees, like perhaps that one on his elbow there, that might be infected by a little fly that we're calling the zombie fly. The zombie fly is this creature, Apocephalus borealis. It's in a group called the phorid flies. And this is the parasite that I discovered on the San Francisco State campus for the first time, parasitizing honeybees. Now a little bit about the zombie fly. The zombie fly is a native fly to North America. Now remember, the honeybee is introduced. It's brought here from Europe. So this is a fly that's been here for a long time. And that means that this is not something that it's normally been parasitized or eating before. Before that, it was parasitizing bumblebees, our native social bees, and things like yellow jacket wasps and some of our solitary bees and wasps as well. But at some point, it expanded its host range to include the European honeybee. And the interesting thing about these parasitized honeybees is that they show strange behavior. They fly out of their hives at night, they abandon their hives, and if there's a light nearby, they'll get attracted to those lights. They'll sort of fly around, bounce around in a kind of disoriented zombie-like fashion, thus the name zombies or zombie bees, because they look like they've been taken over by some other kind of creature. And then, unfortunately for them, in a short period of time, they will fall to the ground and die with these parasites developing on the inside of them. Now, if you look at the female fly there, you'll see that she has an ovipositor, and that's her egg-laying device. It's just like a hypodermic needle. So she can insert that into the body of a honeybee, shoot eggs in, they hatch into little fly larvae. What are fly larvae? Maggots, yeah. So this is a little maggot producer, and those maggots then develop on the inside of the honeybee. We call this a parasitoid. Parasitoids are parasites that kill their host. Now, all of us brought our parasites with us today, right? We probably have parasitic mites living in our hair follicles. Somebody probably has a tapeworm. Anybody eating sushi lately? Yeah, that's all right. You don't have to tell me. You may have gotten some things as well. But for the most part, these are things that just eat a little bit at a time and, live and let live. but parasitoids become voracious predators and eventually just eat the insides out of these honeybees. So it's bad news for honeybees. That means we can now add phorid flies to this list of threats to honeybees in North America. And there's some questions then about how big a threat and where it might be happening outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. But before that, a bit about phorid flies. How many people in here have heard about phorid flies before? Yeah, these people don't count. They were actually working on some of this stuff in San Francisco, so they don't count. But phorid flies, it turns out, are actually a big group of flies. There are 4,000 species of phorid flies that have been described so far. And there are probably at least 8,000 species because we don't know them very well. I have a colleague in Los Angeles who works for the Natural History Museum of LA County. He's a specialist on phorid flies for North America. He bet one of the trustees that he could find a new species of phorid fly in this guy's backyard in Los Angeles. And of course, he expected a little bit of contribution to the museum for this, of course, but it's just a friendly bet among scientists and trustees. And so, as part of this whole program, he set out traps all around the LA basin in various backyards, including this guy's backyard. And at last total, they published 40 new species of phorid flies from the LA basin, primarily from people's backyards. All right, so that's how poorly known this group of flies are. How many species of mammals do you think there are? Yeah, maybe 6,000 on a good day. There are more phorid flies, more different kinds of phorid flies than there are mammals, even though virtually no one's ever heard of them, except maybe the groupies who really are in the CSI programs. Because sometimes you hear about them from the nerdy entomologist on a crime scene investigation program saying, oh, I found Megacelia scalaris pupae in this corpse, and that probably means that this poor person died about a week ago. And usually they don't know what they're talking about, but they'll say Megacelia a few times. Makes it sound really good. And Megacelia scalaris is actually one of our most common phorids, found all over the world, feeding on all kinds of things, including dead human bodies sometimes, but even reputedly in latex paint, and sometimes in living things. It's now been reported feeding on living honeybees in Europe and North Africa as well. Some of the most well-studied phorids, though, are those that are parasites or parasitoids of ants. And they've been introduced into areas where fire ants have gotten introduced from South America, especially the southeastern U.S. These ants that have really nasty stings and big hives that they produce big nests. And so they've actually been released to try and control them. And they're very specialized to these particular kinds of fire ants. So one of the other take-home messages from this talk is that mammals are a modest group. Right? And phorids rule, right? Okay? So here's one of these ants. This is a fire ant. And you'll see this little phorid fly flying in. You can see the ant knows something's up. It's kind of taking a defensive posture. It's too late at this point. The fly will land on it quickly, lay an egg in its abdomen. It'll hatch into a little maggot that'll eat the inside of that ant out and eventually kill it. Before that, the ant will crawl away. It'll become a zombie ant, basically, and crawl away. Now, I want to make sure that everybody understands that this particular group of phorids is not the same group as I'm talking about in honeybees. When we first published on this phorid in honeybees, a number of people, especially in the southeastern U.S., said, aha, the USDA has done it again. They've released these biocontrol agents, and now they're taking out all of our honeybees. We knew that was going to happen. Different species. These guys are specialists on ants, specifically on fire ants. The thing I'm talking about specializes in bees and wasps. And it was already here. It wasn't introduced. It was a honeybee that we brought in. Interestingly, though, things get worse for the ant. Sometimes these things are called decapitating flies because when the ant completes its life cycle, it'll push out right about here. It'll pop the head off of the ant. Yeah, it's pretty nasty. And to add insult to injury, that larva will pupate in the head capsule of the ant that it's popped off. And you can see this fly emerging now, the adult fly, out of the head capsule. So a pupa is kind of like the chrysalis of a butterfly. It's where the adult fly is produced. And So you may also hear these things called decapitating flies sometimes. But I want to take you to San Francisco now, where I've been working for 40 years. This is Hensel Hall, the biology building. Some people will recognize it. And it's the place where I do all of my teaching and research and have my office and so on. And like I said, I've been doing this for 40 years. And one of the things that I'm most proud of over that 40-year period is that I've never bought a parking permit. You know, the nastiest things that happen on campuses are arguments over who gets the best parking. And I just didn't want to deal with that. So I never got a parking permit. When I was chair, I'd get faculty members coming in crying because they didn't get the parking permit they wanted. I said, that's all right, you can have my parking place. They didn't laugh a whole lot, but I thought it was pretty good. So what do? I come in and I compete with the students. I get there early and park on 19th Avenue, right outside the Hensel Hall, which opens onto 19th Avenue. I walk in through that open space every morning. And I started noticing when I was walking in a few years ago that there were all of these honeybees on the sidewalk underneath that overhang. They were just sort of walking around in circles, ambling about, acting strangely. And you know how sometimes you have those kind of aha moments where you suddenly see things and stuff comes together and it all makes sense. Sometimes it's a very simple answer, but you just hadn't been able to see it before until you got the right circumstances. This was it, one of those aha moments. I looked at it and immediately I knew, I saw, I thought, mantis food. Which is what I assume most of you had already thought before. It just took me longer to come up with it, right? So why mantis food? Well, it turns out that I had come back from a field trip with my entomology students, actually not too far from here, just west of Patterson in the Coast Range there in Del Porto Canyon, where we often go. And we brought back several hungry female praying mantids. We needed something to feed them. So I started picking up these mantids. And again, just like you, I'm sure, I always carry a vial around with me. So I simply bent down, started putting these things into vials, taking them down, feeding to the mantid, and they loved them. They ate them. They started producing egg capsules. We started getting little baby mantids. Everybody was happy until one day, instead of feeding the mantid, I went up to my office on the 5th floor instead of down to the 2nd floor where these mantids were, set that down on my desk, checked my email, started working on my lecture for the 8 o'clock lecture I had, and it sat there for a long time. I don't know how long, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. But when I came back and finally noticed it, I noticed all these little brown pellets inside of that vial that the bees had been in. And that's when I knew that something was happening inside of these bees. They were parasitized by some kind of fly, didn't know what it was, reared it out. That took about another month. And then I recognized them as phorid flies, but I don't know phorid flies other than the family. But I did know that Brian Brown was the specialist on it, so I called him up, sent him photographs, eventually sent him specimens. He recognized it immediately as Apocephalus borealis, a species he'd worked on before. But the difference here was that he only knew it from bumblebees and yellow jacket wasps, and this was the first time it had been seen in a honeybee. And of course, honeybees are big business. So something that was kind of an interesting curiosity before suddenly potentially became something of broad interest outside of the narrow biology interest that it might have. I might ask you, Apocephalus borealis, interesting name. How do you think it got that name? It's kind of we always name things in Latin in science. Apocephalus, cephalus head, apo pops the head off. So it's related to some of these things that are decapitating flies. But how about borealis? Northern, yeah, the aurora borealis, the boreal forest. So this fly was originally described for the first time to science from Maine. Right? I'm discovering it in honeybees in San Francisco, but this is a fly that's found broadly all over North America. So it's potentially something that could be in honeybees all over North America, literally from Alaska down to the Mexican border. Shortly after that, I had started calling around to people who knew honeybees, because I really didn't know much about honeybees. I just sort of backed into this stuff. And I called Eric Musson up at UC Davis, who's was the extension entomologist there and really knowledgeable about honeybees. And I asked Eric, have you ever gotten phorid flies out of honeybees before? And he said, no, I haven't. But I've been getting these phone calls lately about people complaining about honeybees coming to their porch lights and to their garage lights and things like that. Might these things be coming to a light? And I'd been walking around looking down, right, not looking up. This is my strategy in an urban environment, is always look down. So you never know what you might step on, right? So I walked back outside after I hung up talking to Eric and looked up, and sure enough, they were under a bank of lights. And if you look in the lens of that light, you can see all these dead honeybees that had gotten trapped up there. If you'd go out at night, as when this video was taken, you'd find them tumbling around the light at the top and eventually falling down and showing this zombie-like behavior of walking around in circles and so on. Where were they coming from? They were coming from a hive that my colleague Gretchen Laboon, who runs the Great Sunflower Project, which is another great citizen science project, had placed right next to the base of the building. And basically these bees were going on a flight of the living dead up to those lights, straight up there each night and getting trapped and eventually dying under the lights. Now I have to be careful about using Flight of the Living Dead now. I found out that there's actually a not very good movie about zombies on a plane that's called Flight of the Living Dead. So I could be infringing copyright or something. So I'm trying to start calling it the Night of the Flying Dead instead, so that I won't infringe someone's copyright on it. But if you were to go up there where we'd always collect the bees and look down under those lights, this is what you would see. Bees like this, walking around in circles, disoriented, obviously having some physiological problems. So what a great opportunity to do research. These are two of my graduate students who latched onto this right away. Opportunity to get their master's thesis work done close to home. You don't have to travel very far. You can get a lot of data quickly. And they did, and they were both authors. Andy was actually the first author on the publication that we put out a few years ago about this phenomenon. And here is a photograph of a zombie in the making. This photograph is one of my favorites. It was taken by Chris Kwok, who at this time was an undergraduate at San Francisco State. Since he's graduated with his master's degree, and he's now a lecturer at San Francisco State teaching courses there as well. Phenomenal photograph. You have to appreciate what was going on at the time this photograph was taken. This was happening in a plastic box that flies had been put into, and the bee was running around frantically. So getting one good shot like this was really amazing. Chris did an excellent job. It eventually ended up in Time magazine and a variety of other outlets around the world, and has become kind of the icon of our project now. And what you're seeing is that female fly landing on the abdomen of the bee, and she's found the weak spot. The weak spot is the membranes between the hard plates that make up the abdomen. And she's quickly inserting eggs into that bee. They'll hatch into maggots, and eventually the bee will die in a few days. And then in another 5 or 6 days, the maggots will come out and eventually pupate. Here's a video that shows that in real time. And you can see it's almost like a pack of wolves going after that poor bee. And in that case, there were 3 or 4 or 5 flies on the bee at a single time. Now we can get as many as 18 maggots out of a single honeybee. So it's probably true in nature that sometimes they get hit by more than one fly as well. Here's what happens at the end. All right? So in most cases, these flies don't decapitate the bees. Occasionally they do, maybe 5% of the time, but mostly not. There's a membrane right here, and the larvae always find that weak spot, and they push their way out, and then they start squiggling away and eventually pupating off to the side someplace. Everybody had dinner tonight? Your stomach feeling good? Okay, well, I'm going to show you a video of this. It'll start in soft focus, so if you want to look aside or something, that's okay. So I'll be all right with me. Here it comes into focus. And there are the maggots. coming out of this bee. Now this bee is long dead. It's been dead for 5 or 6 days by the time that this is happening, so it's not feeling any pain from this, but it also has virtually nothing left on the inside of it. All of its wing muscles have been eaten. Most of its insides have been eaten by these maggots. And then they will move on, sort of slither away, and form the little brown pupae that you can see some of them there at the base of this container. You can see one hitting off to the side there, kind of a looping, almost leech-like locomotion. And then there's what the pupae look like. The pupae are distinctive enough that we can usually tell them by a good photograph of them, if someone sends us a photograph. And if you're unfortunate, your hive might have a lot of these in them. This is a sample taken by a beekeeper in San Francisco that we work with. Virtually every bee in this sample was infected by this parasite. And you can see there probably were literally hundreds of pupae that came out of those bees. This is only a portion of that sample. Now, as I mentioned, the fly also infects things like bumblebees. Here's a shot of one on a bumblebee. This is the more acrobatic fly. You know, look, ma, no hands. It's pretty amazing. We do fly Olympics sometimes when we're kind of bored on these things, but this is one of the better ones. And also in things like yellow jacket wasps. You can see the pupa at the bottom of this yellow jacket trap, for instance. And one of the questions that we asked early on was, is it possible that these might actually be different species of flies that are in different species of wasps and bees? So we wanted to test that, and we tested it by using DNA technology, something called DNA barcoding. So we sequenced a particular gene for samples from yellow jackets, from bumblebees, and from honeybees, and compared them. And you can see why it's called DNA barcoding. You get this sort of barcode of the genetic sequence. You can compare it, and the take-home message is they're all basically the same. It's same kinds of flies in different hosts, not different flies specialized to different hosts. So that still leaves us with a variety of questions. How widespread is this phorid parasitism in honeybees? Is it potentially an emerging problem, like an emerging disease, something that's starting perhaps on the West Coast by groups of flies that have figured it out here, that might spread, especially by the commercial movement of honeybees, to other parts of North America? Or is it something that's been going on a long time and just hasn't been noticed? Are there other reasons why honeybees might fly out of their hives at night? We sometimes get bees that don't appear to be parasitized coming to light. What's going on there? And is the zombie fly somehow controlling honeybees to get them to fly out of their hives at night, land in a place that's good for the fly? And if it's doing that, how is it doing that? Or is it that the bees are committing altruistic suicide to get away from their hives and die where the flies won't find their hive mates as likely? So a lot of questions, but you know, basically the question we were asking was, is this a bad actor in a bee movie, or is it a major player? So how do you answer that question? Well, of course we look for money. What else happens in science, right? So we wrote grants. We sent grants out to the Department of Agriculture. We asked for a few $100,000 to pay for students to go sampling and to sample in various parts of the country. And we got good reviews on the grants, but you know, grants are hard to get these days. About 6 to 8% of the grants to the USDA get funded. That's the extent of our funding of science in this country at the moment. So we got our back, and unfortunately we didn't quite make the cut. We had one reviewer that, while pretty much complimentary, said, you know, I don't know if we know enough about this to say that this is really a big enough problem we should put this much money into. And another reviewer said, you know, we'll be really stupid if we don't jump on this quickly, and it turns out to be big. But it only takes a minor negative comment to mean that your review won't be funded. Even all positive reviews often don't result in funding. So what did we do? Well, of course, we went to the local pizza joint, ordered beer. And we sat around for about 10 minutes and cried in our beer and said how unfair it was. But then we thought, well, let's find another way to do this. And we talked about it. And what we decided to do was, rather than to do an expensive study requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars was to get together with some computer science students and to put together a website and to start a citizen science project, basically to crowdsource discovery. And we've done that, and we've called our project Zombie Watch. Because when we published our initial paper, the media started calling these zombies and zombie bees, and often spelling it like this. And we actually spent a lot of time deciding what we were going to call this project. We thought about all kinds of professional sounding things. And then we looked at each other and we said, no, let's go with Zombie Watch. And it was a good thing, because one of the things you learn in doing citizen science is that you have to do advertising and marketing so that people know that you exist and know enough about your project that in this case they will recognize a relatively rare event when they run into it in their own backyard or on the sidewalk or someplace like that. So we launched Zombie Watch. This is our homepage, anchored with a map of the United States and Canada, showing the records as they come in. It's actually live. As soon as we get a new record, that map changes. The red markers indicate places where we have confirmed records of Apocephalus borealis infecting honeybees, and the yellow ones are things that are in progress. The green ones are apparently uninfected samples. Now, some of those yellow ones have been yellow for a long time because people didn't complete their projects, and that's one of the challenges of citizen science sometimes. So what we ask people to do is to be on the lookout for bees that are acting strangely, and I would ask you to do that as well. And if you see them, carefully place them in a container and then observe them. Take a picture of them, the bees, upload those pictures to our website. You can do it with your cell phone. This is with my iPhone. And then take pictures of any parasites that come out, the pupae, and any adult flies that come out. Upload them to our website. We can often tell what they are just from looking at those photographs. If you come up with a really new find, if someone found one here in the middle of the Central Valley where we don't have many records, we'd ask you to send us the flies so that we could make sure that we know what we're working with. And then we put them up on our website. There also are instructions for making simple, cheap light traps. This is a shop light with a compact black light bulb. It has a lot of ultraviolet radiation coming out of it that insects usually light, but you can just use a regular compact white bulb as well. And then the bottom of that is a beverage container that's been cut off at the top inverted to make a funnel so that when the bees fly in, or other insects as well, hit the light, they'll drop down and get trapped down below, not be able to get out. And here it is in operation actually next to my house, next to the swarm that got into my house and between the walls. And you can see this night probably 40 or 50 bees came to that light. And one of the things that we found is that these bees are flying out on all kinds of nights. It can be raining. It can be even one of the rare frosty nights in January in San Francisco, and we'll still get bees leaving their hives. So it's not because they're flying out on a warm night. They'll fly out under all kinds of awful conditions. And we've gotten kids around the country interested as well. This is a light trap that was designed by some kids in Minnesota. They actually came up with a GoFundMe page to get people to contribute money to build light traps that they then distribute free of charge to beekeepers around the country to check for this fly. Really amazing. I worked with a group of elementary school kids in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and they were doing a robotics competition, and eventually they came up with an automated sampling device, a light trap that would separate samples at different times of the night so you could ask questions about timing of things and so on and not actually have to be out there doing the collections. They actually won second place at a Georgia Tech competition. It was great. They put together a little skit as part of it. That was pretty amazing to watch. They had one little girl dressed up as a fly, another one dressed up as a bee, one of them dressed up as me. And that was kind of strange to look at, you know, with the Einstein hair and lab coat. I never wear a lab coat, but I don't know what they saw on Skype when we were talking. But and then we have information about, you know, putting them in different containers, carefully taking these samples and so on. As I mentioned, we've gotten a lot of new records this way. all the way up the Pacific coast now into British Columbia, and recently on the eastern coast, the Atlantic coast as well, as far north as Nova Scotia. And in this last fall, our first record from Maine, where this fly was originally described from, first record from a honeybee. So that was nice to see. And then all the way down to North Carolina in the Appalachians. Those records coming in again this fall. Here's an example of what some of these samples look like. In this case, I asked the woman who found them to send it to me, and that's the sample she sent from North Carolina. Here's some of the places where citizen scientists have found new records of this fly in honeybees. And in some cases, they've been rewarded by becoming instant media personalities. Mark Hone, there at the bottom, suddenly was on the front page of the Seattle Times and then ended up on the front pages of the London tabloids. So you can imagine going into the underground and somebody's handing you a picture with Mark's, a paper with Mark's face on it. Pretty amazing, and really it's gratifying to see people and to get the recognition they deserve for making real scientific discoveries that really help us try and understand what's going on. This is Tony Cantrell from Vermont. He was the beekeeper that first discovered them in honeybees in the eastern U.S. And an interesting story, he's a hobbyist beekeeper, had a couple of hives, noticed bees coming to his lights at night, thought that was kind of strange, did a Google search, ended up on our website, and started collecting them. And sure enough, they were infected. And then we contacted him, and he contacted us, and we got together and tried to get the media involved in publicizing this so that more people in the East would start looking for them. And I asked Tony, I said, would you be willing to talk to the media about this? Because the media always likes a local connection. You know, they could care less what's happening in San Francisco, but if somebody in Burlington, Vermont is there, then that's big news in Burlington. And he said, no, I'm kind of shy. I don't really want to get involved in that kind of stuff. I said, okay. And the reporter from the Burlington paper kept calling me and said, can you get this guy to talk to me? I said, okay, I'll try one more time. So I called Tony up and said, you know, this reporter would really like to talk to you. He said, okay, I'll do it. And he talked to him, and then the next morning, I think, I get this email from Tony saying, we made the front page. And it was really great because he deserved to get that recognition and to be there on the front page. Now, he's not the one that's the jury slams. That's not Tony. Tony's here on the side. Here's some of the data, just to show that we do have data and facts to go with all of this stuff. This is some collection data from San Francisco State campus. And all you can see here are these peaks. The higher the peak, the higher the incidence of parasitism. The dark peaks are bees that are coming to light at night. The sort of salmon-colored ones are bees that are just taken out of the hive. It's when they're coming back and forth foraging. They're not out at night. And you can see a much higher percentage of those that are coming out at night are infected than those that are flying around. So there really is something about these creatures that are flying out at night. And you can see the clear peaks starting in May and then peaking in summer, fall, and early winter in San Francisco. Now, Tony did this in Burlington, Vermont, and he found a similar pattern. The main difference being that it ends a lot sooner in Burlington, Vermont. The snows start coming in November, and that sort of shuts it down. Here's what we found locally. Basically, in the San Francisco Bay Area and the narrow area, virtually all the hives are infected. 80% of the hives we've sampled have been infected during the fall. And we think if we sampled intensively enough in the others, they probably were infected to some extent as well. But look at Modesto. Look at the Central Valley. We've had very, very few samples that have come from this part of the country. So we'd really like to have people like you out there looking for things, being aware of it. The best time to find them is going to be starting in May, the summer, and into the fall. So remember that, but we're interested in anything that you find at any time of the year, and we're interested if you find bees that are struggling around that turn out not to be infected as well. We'd like to know zeros as well as pluses for these kinds of things. All that information is really important to us. And we found out that they've even invaded Google. And this is almost a national event, right? Zombies invade the Googleplex. Did you know that Google keeps honeybees? And they paint the honeybee hives in Google colors? really quite nice. They have about 200 Googlers that are part of a group that maintain the honeybees around the Google campuses. And then they have a big honey festival in the fall where they extract the honey from it and serve it in the Google cafeterias. So one of the guys that works at Google, who works on Google Maps, called me and he said, hey, I'm seeing all of these flies that are bouncing against the glass doors next to my workspace. Might there be something wrong with them? We isolated them, and in fact they were infected, and there were some scavenger flies with them as well. This is where he was finding them. And if you look closely, you can see all of those little brown things on the ground. Those are dead honeybees that have been attracted to the lights. So this becomes a fascinating thing for people of all ages. We go to a lot of science festivals and so on, and we get a lot of attention from kids and their parents as well, even from kindergarten students who get excited about this stuff. And indeed, they can make important contributions. And they have. They've also documented some things that we didn't know before. They've found yellow jacket wasps that are infected coming to lights at night. So that suggests that maybe this is something that's happening in things beyond honeybees. And they've, in many cases, reported bees coming to light that weren't infected. That raises new questions about what other kinds of things might cause honeybees to be out at night. Viruses, other kinds of stressors. Might this be a window into understanding why, in general, bees might abandon their hive, and a way of backdooring into an explanation for colony collapse disorder. So we've shown that the zombie fly is indeed infecting honeybees, that it's widespread in California and up the Pacific Northwest into Canada, and in the eastern US as well. It's possible that it could be an emerging disease, but we need more information. We haven't shown that it's causing colony collapse disorder at this point, or necessarily that it's always a serious problem for bees, but we're asking citizen scientists to help us answer those questions. And we're asking especially beekeepers to be vigilant, because we know that parasitism rates in bumblebees can exceed 60% of foraging bumblebees. If anything close to that happened in a honeybee hive, that could cause a hive to fail rather quickly. We know that in South America there are forages that are different than this that infect stingless bees and sometimes honeybees that cause hive failures there. And so we need to be looking carefully what's happening here. All the most right for, because this can be a silent killer. Most of the people who are keeping honeybees that have infected hives don't know the hives are infected, because the bees mostly leave and they don't find evidence about that. So finally, I'm going to end by sharing with you some of our more recent research. And this is kind of going off in a different area. And so I'm going to ask you not to talk about this outside this room, because there's some sort of sensitive stuff going on in this. But it got stimulated by this book. It was a recent book that was written by some computer scientists in the Midwest, a young adult book, The Borealis Genome. And in this book, they fictionalize a fly vector of a virus that creates human zombies. Okay. Well, you know, and one of the questions I always get when I give talks like this is, can these things get into people? So it seemed like you really need to figure out what's going on. And there is, you know, some evidence that suggests that maybe we should be concerned about this. And even more than that, if you look at the graduating class at San Francisco State in 2007, just after colony collapse disorder, I mean, there was an outbreak of zombieism. So, I mean, could these things be related? How do you figure this out? Well, it's not easy, because when you work on human beings, there are all kinds of issues you have to deal with. We have human subjects committees. We have all kinds of ethical things that we have to consider when we potentially infect human subjects and follow what happens with them. And that makes it very difficult. There are lots of rules, there are lots of regulations. So in the great tradition of medical entomology, I decided I'd just do it myself. Okay, I'm not going to sign anything, I'm just going to do it. So I set myself up in a place where flies should be common, a lot of flowers where honeybees would be coming up, and had my graduate students in mosquito netting off to the side with binoculars, recording data to see what happened. And sure enough, if you sit there long enough, and they come in, and let's see if I can get that one to do it again. Yeah, right there. They get you right here in the crease in your forehead. The older you get, the more susceptible you are to these things. Now we do have some preliminary results, and as you can see, it's a sublethal infection. All right, I didn't die. So I'm here, I can talk to you. There were a few changes. There are a few morphological changes that I'm still trying to deal with. And there were some dietary changes that I'm still adjusting to as well. I had a wonderful dinner tonight. I want to thank everybody for that. But one of the things I missed on the menu was brains. And you may have seen me thumbing through that menu over and over again looking for it. Couldn't find it. Next time, all right? You'll notice you'll rarely see me in short sleeves these days because the scabs take a long time to heal. Okay, here's some of the folks. Only a portion of the people that have worked on this over the years. Brian Brown at the LA County Museum. Lila Higgins is the citizen science coordinator there. Dragutin Pekovic is the former chair of computer science at San Francisco State. Andy Zink, Chris Moffett, our colleagues who've worked on this project at San Francisco State. Chris Kroc, who took those wonderful photos and videos. Andy Core, Jonathan Ivers worked on it. Erica Bueno has just finished up. Erica is doing some interesting stuff, asking the question of, could these flies be manipulating the timing of turning on of genes in honeybees that affect their behavior? So we know that there's a gene called the period gene that affects circadian behavior, which is the daily rhythm of a honeybee. Could it be that the fly is somehow getting the bee to turn it on at the wrong time so that it becomes awake at night rather than active during the day? And she's just completing her work on that. We'll see what she finds out. Rashid, Danius, and Asim, three outstanding computer programmers. Robert McAmey, our consulting beekeeper in San Francisco who runs City Bees, a small commercial bee operation. So I'll finish there.